The chamber had been silent for 11 minutes when Ambassador Yeel Theron finally stopped reviewing the transmission logs and simply sat with what she had read. Not because the content was complex. The content was, by every measurable standard, simple. Earth had received the Galactic Council's formal ultimatum. Earth had acknowledged receipt. Earth had responded within the specified window. These were the expected steps. These were the steps every pre-contact civilization performed when confronted with the weight of a unified galactic voice speaking in one direction. What was not expected was the nature of Earth's response, not the words themselves. Yeel Theron had read the words 3 times now, and each time she found herself returning not to what the humans had said, but to what they had chosen not to say. The response was 4 sentences long. 4 sentences in reply to a 47-page ultimatum representing the formal position of 212 sovereign civilizations. And buried in the 3rd sentence, almost conversationally, was a phrase that her translation matrix kept flagging as either a mistranslation or a concept without direct parallel in any registered language. The phrase, rendered as closely as the system could manage, was, "We have already begun." Already begun what the humans had not explained. The Council's lead arbiter, a Meth Sauran elder named Counselor Deher Vaz, had dismissed it as posturing. Pre-contact civilizations frequently attempted aggressive language when cornered. It was a documented phase, listed in the Galactic Integration Codex between denial and negotiated capitulation. The humans were performing the expected emotional theater. They would settle. They always settled. That was 11 days ago. Yeel Theron set down her reader and looked out the observation port at the stars, and tried to remember why she had agreed with him then, and whether she still agreed with him now. Marcus Chen had not slept in 61 hours when they put him in the chair across from the delegation. He didn't look like a man representing the future of his species. He looked like a man who had spilled coffee on his shirt sometime in the previous 2 days and genuinely hadn't noticed. He had the particular stillness of someone who has moved past exhaustion into whatever country exists on the other side of it, where the body stops negotiating and simply continues. His eyes were clear. That was the part that unsettled Yeel Theron when she later reviewed the recording. Not sharp, not calculating, just clear, as if the fatigue had burned away everything that wasn't essential. He was the only human in the room who was not military. The Council had assumed this was weakness. A civilization sending a civilian to a formal surrender negotiation was, by any rational interpretation, a civilization that did not understand what it was facing. The Meth Sauran contingent had privately noted it as confirmation of Earth's fundamental unsophistication. The Velharan observers had agreed. Even Yeel Theron, who had spent more time studying human communication patterns than most of her colleagues, had filed it under cultural misalignment and moved on. She would spend a long time thinking about that later. Marcus placed a single physical object on the table between them. Not a data chip, not a weapon, a folded piece of paper. Paper. Organic cellulose fiber processed and flattened into sheets, a technology so prehistoric that the Council's materials analyst had to request a historical reference file to identify it. He left it there, folded, and did not explain it. Counselor Deher Vaz stared at it for a moment and then chose, with magnificent confidence, to ignore it. "Ambassador Chen," the counselor began, and Marcus gently corrected him. "Just Marcus is fine." There was a pause. Ambassadors did not correct their titles at formal negotiations. This was not how it worked. Deher Vaz recalibrated smoothly and continued. "The Council's position remains as stated in the ultimatum. Earth will surrender administrative sovereignty over its solar system to the Galactic Integration Authority. Your population will retain cultural autonomy within registered parameters. Your resources will be managed under the Sustainability Covenant. This is not a punitive measure. This is standard integration protocol." Marcus nodded slowly. "We know," he said. Another pause. "Then you understand that resistance is not a viable option." "We know that too," Marcus said. Deher Vaz had been doing this for longer than most civilizations had possessed written language. He recognized the shape of what he was hearing. This was the language of a civilization that had accepted the mathematics of its situation. Earth had done the calculation, understood the outcome, and arrived at negotiation ready to discuss terms. This was, in fact, the ideal outcome, clean, efficient, a model integration. "Then we may proceed to the formal. "I didn't say we were surrendering," Marcus said. He said it the way someone might note that it was raining outside, a simple observation about the state of things. The room produced a very specific quality of silence, not empty silence, occupied silence, the kind that forms when a large number of very intelligent beings simultaneously revise their model of a situation and find that the new model doesn't fit. Yale Theron was watching Marcus's hands. She would later report this as the first moment she understood that something was wrong with her assumptions. Not his words, his hands. They were resting flat on the table, still. Not gripping the edge, not tapping, not pressed together. The hands of someone who was not afraid, not performing calm, actually not afraid. She had studied human physiological stress responses extensively. She knew what human fear looked like at the cellular level. Marcus Chen was not afraid. She didn't know what to do with that. The phrase "we have already begun" acquired its first concrete meaning 6 days after the negotiation, when the Council's automated monitoring network registered a series of unusual energy signatures originating from Earth's outer system. Not weapons, not ships, something stranger. The Vel-Heron technical team that reviewed the data spent several hours in quiet disagreement before issuing a formal report. Their conclusion was that Earth had launched several thousand objects into carefully distributed trajectories throughout the solar system. The objects were small, inert, no apparent propulsion, no weapon signatures, no communication arrays. They appeared to be, and the technical team noted this with visible discomfort, seeds, not literal seeds, but objects following long elliptical paths that would, over the course of approximately 40 to 100 years, deposit their payloads at specific coordinates throughout the solar system and beyond. The payloads themselves resisted full analysis, some kind of organic synthetic composite. The Vel-Heron team could identify components but not function. The components included information storage matrices, biological preservation media, and something their instruments kept categorizing as emotional imprint data, which was not a category their instruments had been designed to detect, so they flagged it as a calibration error and moved on. This was their second catastrophic mistake. Counselor Deher Vaz reviewed the report and made a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. The seeds were irrelevant to immediate negotiations. Even if they represented some kind of long-term project, they were harmless. A civilization scattering small objects around its solar system posed no tactical threat. He ordered the monitoring team to log them and return to the primary concern. The primary concern was Earth's stubborn failure to formally surrender, because Earth had still not surrendered. Earth had, in fact, continued to function normally. Their governments met. Their economies operated. Their population of approximately 9 billion went about the business of existing in ways that suggested they had not fully processed the reality of 212 civilizations united in a single demand. Ships were built. Infrastructure was expanded. Children were born and given names and taught to read. The Galactic Council's ultimatum deadline passed, and then the extended deadline passed, and Earth responded to both expirations with what could only be described as polite indifference. This created a problem the Council had not encountered in its recorded history. Standard integration protocol had a precise sequence: ultimatum, response, negotiation, surrender, administrative transfer. The process had worked without significant variation across 97 integration events over 6,000 years. There was no documented case of a civilization simply continuing, not surrendering, not resisting militarily, not fleeing, just continuing. The Codex did not have a category for it. Deher Vaz consulted the Codex's emergency addendum. He consulted the historical archives. He consulted 3 separate Methsoran legal scholars and 2 Vel-Heron strategic analysts. The universal consensus was that Earth's behavior was irrational and therefore self-correcting. A civilization could not indefinitely ignore the reality of its situation. Eventually, the pressure of that reality would produce the expected response. They decided to wait. They were still waiting when Marcus Chen requested a second meeting. This time he brought a woman named Dr. Adiz Akafer. She was introduced as a specialist in long-duration planning. She wore the same kind of unremarkable clothing Marcus did, and she had the same quality of contained stillness. What she did not have was the weariness. Adiz Akafar looked as if she had slept deeply and regularly and was prepared to continue doing so indefinitely. Yil Theron noticed that when Marcus and Adiz entered the room, they walked slightly differently than they had in previous footage she'd studied of human diplomatic interactions. She couldn't immediately identify the difference. Something in the carriage, the angle of orientation, like people who knew where every door in a building was without needing to look. The council opened the meeting with a restatement of its position, delivered with the kind of patience one extends to a being who has not yet understood what they've been told. Adiz listened to the full restatement without expression. Then she asked a question. "How long," she said, "does the council estimate it would take to physically enforce integration if Earth declined to cooperate?" There was a short internal debate among the delegation about whether to answer. The answer was not a secret. The information was available in public council records. Enforcement projection for a Class 4 civilization resistant to integration, between 8 and 14 months of active operation, depending on resistance levels. They told her this. She nodded as if she'd expected it. "And how long," she said, "does the council estimate integration would take if Earth's population declined to cooperate with the Integration Administration after enforcement?" A longer silence. This was not a question the Codex addressed directly. Enforcement and administrative integration were technically separate phases. The assumption, the foundational, never-examined assumption, was that a population whose military had been defeated would subsequently cooperate with administrative processes. Because why wouldn't they? The alternative was pointless. It served no rational purpose. Deher Vaz told her, with careful patience, that post-enforcement administrative integration typically proceeded smoothly. Populations that had experienced enforcement understood the new reality of their circumstances and adapted accordingly. Typically, Adiz said, in all recorded cases. How many of those cases, she asked, involved a civilization that had already been planning for this conversation for 30 years? The room temperature did not change. The physical parameters of the chamber remained identical, but something shifted, and Yil Theron felt it happen, and she looked at Marcus, and Marcus was watching Deher Vaz with the same quiet, clear eyes, and there was something in them she finally identified correctly. Not fear, not aggression, not the theatrical defiance of a cornered species performing its last dignity. Patience. Marcus Chen had the eyes of someone who was comfortable with very long timelines. The Council's deep archive search happened that evening. Yil Theron had requested it informally, using language that wouldn't trigger a formal review. She asked the archive to pull all references to human strategic communications that predated first contact. There were more than she expected. Humanity had detected the Council's presence, not definitively, but probabilistically, approximately 31 years before first contact was formally initiated. They had detected it through patterns in deep space communication interference, through subtle gravitational anomalies, through a dozen other barely their signals that had been filed under anomalous and quietly handed to a specific working group that operated out of an unremarkable building in 3 different cities simultaneously. The working group had never been announced. It had never been formally acknowledged. 31 years of work, and the public record of it was nearly absent. Not suppressed. Just quiet. The way you might conduct work that you wanted to complete before anyone asked you what you were doing. The work appeared to be, based on the fragmented documentation Yil Theron was able to reconstruct, a comprehensive analysis of every possible first contact scenario, with specific attention to scenarios that resulted in forced integration. They had not been building a defense. They had been building something else. The archive search flagged a document from 11 years ago, a dense technical paper written in 3 languages simultaneously, Mandarin, Yoruba, and Icelandic, which was an odd combination that Yil Theron couldn't immediately explain. The translation matrix worked slowly through it. The paper was theoretical in framing, but its subject was essentially this. What does a civilization look like from the outside if it has decided to never psychologically surrender? And how would that behavior be misinterpreted by a civilization that had no framework for it? Yil Theron read that sentence 4 times. She sent an urgent message to Deher Vaz. He was asleep. His assistant acknowledged receipt and assured her the counselor would review it in the morning. She sat alone in the dark and looked at the stars and tried to count backwards from 31 years to figure out what the humans had been building toward, and kept arriving at a number that couldn't be right, because the number implied that Earth had been preparing for this conversation before the Council had decided to have it, which meant either she was wrong about the timeline, or the humans had known something about the Council's intentions before the Council had formalized those intentions. Neither option was comfortable. The paper on the table, the folded piece of paper Marcus Chen had placed there in the first meeting and never explained, had been bothering Yil Theron since she saw it. She finally requested a physical examination. The Council's forensic team analyzed it carefully. It was a letter, handwritten, in a form of English that the translation matrix noted was slightly archaic in phrasing, as if written by someone who had deliberately chosen formality over natural speech. The letter was addressed to no one. It described in plain language a set of instructions for a specific location on Earth's moon. The instructions described where to find a sealed container. The container, the letter said, held everything a survivor would need to know. Survivor of what, the letter did not explain. The forensic team dated the paper. The letter had been written 7 years ago. It had been waiting, folded, on a table that Marcus Chen had not yet entered, for a meeting that had not yet been scheduled, as part of a negotiation that had not yet been initiated. Someone had written instructions for survivors 7 years before there was anything to survive. Yil Theron filed an emergency formal report. She used the word premeditation 6 times. She used the word disturbing twice, which for a Velharan ambassador in a formal document was the equivalent of screaming. Deher Vaz called a full council session. It lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, they reached a conclusion that felt logical, that felt grounded in precedent, that felt like the kind of decision that experienced interstellar administrators make when confronted with evidence that a primitive civilization is attempting psychological manipulation. They decided that Earth was bluffing. The seeds in the solar system were a misdirection. The paper was theater. The 31-year preparation timeline, if accurate, simply meant the humans were clever posturers. Every civilization faced with integration eventually tried to make itself seem larger and more prepared than it was. Earth was doing the same thing with unusual creativity. The enforcement fleet was authorized. What happened next took 11 minutes. Not in the way battles happen in 11 minutes. Not explosions, not destroyed ships, not the fast kinetic violence of military engagement. The fleet entered the outer system as planned. The fleet encountered no resistance. The fleet proceeded on schedule toward Earth, and then the fleet's command structure stopped. Not disabled, not jammed, stopped. Every command channel between fleet vessels and central command produced accurate transmission and no effect. Orders were sent. Orders were received and confirmed. Nothing happened. The fleet's individual ship captains, suddenly without coordinated guidance, began making individual decisions. This was the first mistake. Individual decisions in a coordinated fleet operation produced conflicting movement vectors. Conflicting vectors produced proximity alerts. Proximity alerts produced automated evasive protocols. Automated evasive protocols in close formation produced cascading response chains that the fleet's design had never been tested against because the scenario, a fleet of 200 vessels in close formation with no functioning command coordination, had never been anticipated because it had never happened. It had never happened because no one had thought of it. The humans had thought of it. The specific technical mechanism by which the humans had isolated fleet command coordination remained, for weeks afterward, not fully understood. The Velharan technical teams eventually reconstructed a partial picture. The humans had seeded the outer system, not with weapons, but with what could only be described as a communication environment. A very specific distortion field, assembled from thousands of small distributed components, positioned across months using trajectories that looked like random solar system debris. The distortion did not block communication. It passed it, perfectly, with one modification. Every command-level authorization signal was reflected back with a delay of exactly 1.3 seconds. 1.3 seconds does not sound significant. 1.3 seconds is a blink. But fleet coordination operates on timing windows measured in milliseconds, and a command signal that arrives 1.3 seconds after expected is, from the fleet's automated system's perspective, either a retransmission error or a spoofed hostile signal. In either case, the automated response was to hold. Request confirmation. Wait. Confirmation was sent. 1.3 seconds later, it arrived appearing to be either a retransmission error or a spoofed hostile signal. The fleet held. Requested confirmation. Waited. The Council, watching from a distance, sent override commands. The override commands arrived. The override commands appeared, from the fleet's automated system's perspective, to be either retransmission errors or spoofed hostile signals. The fleet held. Requested confirmation. Waited. For 11 minutes, the greatest single naval assembly the Galactic Council had deployed in 400 years sat motionless in Earth's outer system, locked in a courteous automated loop with itself, politely requesting confirmation of commands it was simultaneously receiving and ignoring. Then the humans sent a message. It was addressed to every ship captain individually, by name, in that ship captain's native language. It contained no threats. It contained no demands. It contained only a set of coordinates and a single sentence. If you would like to understand what you are actually dealing with, come here. 14 ship captains went to the coordinates. The coordinates led to a structure, not on Earth, not on any of Earth's recognized installations, on one of the gas giant's inner moons, in a location that the Council's charts listed as uninhabited and geologically inhospitable. The structure was old, not ancient, not primitive. 14 to 17 years old by material dating. It had been built in a place that looked abandoned because it was meant to look abandoned. Inside, the 14 captains found what they would later describe as a library. Data storage, yes, but also physical records, also artwork, also what appeared to be a collection of objects chosen for meaning rather than function. A child's shoe, a recording of music. A pressed flower sealed under glass, still showing color after however many years it had sat in the dark. And a message, recorded by a woman they didn't recognize, speaking in a language the translation matrices handled easily because it was calm and precise and chose its words with care. She had recorded the message 9 years ago. She was not threatening them. She was explaining something. She said, "You are trying to understand what we will do next. That is the wrong question. The right question is what we have already done and how long ago we did it and how many layers there are between what you can see and what is actually in motion. We are not bluffing. We are not performing strength we don't have. We have been building this for a generation and we intend to continue building it for several more. What you experienced today was not our defense. It was our introduction." She paused. "We don't want to fight you. We want you to understand who you are dealing with before one of us does something neither side can take back. You have time to make a different decision. We have planned for both outcomes." She looked directly at the recording device, and later, when the 14 captains described this moment, they each mentioned this separately, without prompting, as if it was the specific detail that had stayed with them. She did not look afraid. Yil Tharon was the one who found the name. The woman in the recording, she was listed in Earth's public research databases as Dr. Miriam Vasquez, theoretical strategist, affiliated with something called the Long Continuity Project. The Long Continuity Project had no public charter. Its funding was distributed across 11 different academic institutions in 9 countries. Its publications, when they appeared at all, were in journals that specialized in fields like systems resilience and adaptive institutional memory and civilization-scale decision architecture. Yil Tharon read everything she could find. The Long Continuity Project's central thesis, as best she could reconstruct it from a decade of diffuse publications, was not military. It was not political. It was this, that any civilization threatened with forced dissolution had exactly one viable long-term strategy, and that strategy was not to win but to become impossible to fully end, to distribute itself, to embed itself in places that couldn't all be reached simultaneously, to store knowledge, identity, intent, and capacity in enough locations, in enough forms with enough redundancy, that destroying any portion of it simply revealed more layers, the seeds in the solar system, the structure on the moon, the letter on the table, 31 years of quiet preparation, seeding not weapons but continuity across every accessible surface of the solar system, and Yil Tharon now suspected beyond it. Not defenses, not traps, archives, Redundancies. Instructions written by people who understood they might not be there to give them, addressed to survivors who might need to begin again from very little and would find, if they looked, that someone had already prepared for that. She sat with this for a long time. Then she understood what had happened to the fleet and she felt cold. The 1.3-second delay, the communication distortion, the seeds in the outer system, those were not the human defense. She had thought they were. The Council had thought they were. They were not. They were a demonstration, chosen specifically to demonstrate capability without causing casualties. The humans had disabled the greatest fleet in galactic history without destroying a single vessel, without killing a single crew member, using infrastructure they had placed years ago for exactly this conversation. And the scale of coordination required to deploy that infrastructure quietly, over years, across an entire solar system, while appearing to cooperate with standard pre-contact monitoring. The scale of that coordination implied an organizational structure the Council had no record of, a structure that had been operating in plain sight for at minimum 31 years, a structure that was still operating. She thought about what Marcus had said in the first meeting, in that quiet conversational tone. "You have already begun," and she realized she had assumed begun referred to the future, preparations that were starting, plans that were being initiated, but the letter had been written 7 years ago. The structure on the moon was 14 years old. The seeds had been in transit for longer than the ultimatum had existed. Already begun was past tense. It had been past tense when he said it. Whatever the humans had begun, it had been in motion before the Council had decided to send the ultimatum. Before the Council had made the internal decision to target Earth. Before the Council had even formally classified Earth as a candidate for integration. There had been people on that small, rocky planet quietly working in unremarkable buildings in 9 countries, distributing pieces of something enormous across dimensions the Council had not thought to look in, and they had done it not in secret, but in the kind of careful openness that only looks invisible if you're not paying attention in exactly the right way. Yeel Theron filed her report. The Council read it. HFY called an emergency session, and it was during that emergency session, while the Council debated what to do about an integration candidate that appeared to have prepared for integration before integration had been decided upon, that they received a second message from Earth. This one was not from Marcus. It was not from Adiz. It was signed by 412 names representing what the header described as the scientific, cultural, and institutional memory of Earth's first distributed continuity network. The message was long. Yeel Theron read it 3 times. The message said, in careful language, that the Council was welcome to proceed with whatever course of action it judged appropriate. It said that Earth's population understood the Council's position and respected the complexity of managing a galactic community of 212 civilizations. It said that humanity had no interest in establishing dominance, no interest in replacing the Council, no desire for conflict. And then it said something that stopped the session completely. It said that the Council should know, in the interest of transparency, that the Long Continuity Project had been sharing its research and its methodology with 11 other pre-contact civilizations across the galaxy. Civilizations that had detected the Council's presence through the same subtle signals humanity had used. Civilizations that had been, independently, doing similar work. Civilizations that had, over the past 12 years, been in quiet communication with one another through the same distributed infrastructure humanity had developed. The Council's galaxy was not empty space between civilizations waiting to be integrated. It was a network, and the network had been listening. The Council emergency session lasted 19 hours. Marcus was alone in the temporary quarters the Council had provided him when Yeel Theron knocked. He opened the door and looked at her, and she didn't know what to say, so she said the thing she'd been thinking about since she read the second message. "You knew we were coming," she said, "before we decided to come." Marcus stepped back to let her in. The room was small. On the desk was a cup of something hot that smelled organic and complex, and a photograph of 2 people she didn't recognize, and a book, not a data chip, a physical book with pages worn at the spine. "We suspected," Marcus said. "Patterns were there if you looked." "How long?" He picked up the photograph and looked at it, put it down. "My grandmother was on the original working group. She died 8 years ago." He paused. "She wrote the letter. Yil Theron looked at the folded paper she'd brought with her, the original from the Council's forensic archive, cleared for return. She set it on the desk next to the photograph. She wrote it 7 years ago, she said. She died 8 years ago. She wrote it before she died, Marcus said. She wanted it placed in a specific context. She had specific ideas about what kind of moment would make a person actually read it. He looked at Yil Theron steadily. She was very precise about that kind of thing. Yil Theron looked at the photograph. 2 people. An older woman and a child, maybe 10 years old, both of them looking not at the camera but at something beyond it, and both of them wearing the same expression: patience. The same quiet, impossible patience. The network, Yil Theron said. The other civilizations, how many of them have been doing what you've been doing? Marcus sat down. He looked tired, finally. Not afraid, not uncertain, but genuinely tired, the way you can only look when you've been carrying something for a very long time. Enough, he said. Enough, he said again, gently. She looked at him. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the worn spine of the book and thought about a woman who had spent the last years of her life writing letters addressed to no one and placing them in rooms that hadn't been built yet, for conversations that hadn't been scheduled, because she had understood something about the shape of the future with enough precision to prepare the furniture for it. What do you want? Yil Theron asked. Not the political answer. What do you actually want? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Time, he said finally. We want time. We want to keep existing on our own terms, making our own mistakes, learning what we need to learn at the speed we need to learn it. We're not ready for integration, not because we're primitive, because we know what we still need to figure out about ourselves, and we need to be the ones to figure it out. He paused. Your council has been integrating civilizations for 6,000 years. You've been doing it the same way for 6,000 years. And every civilization you integrate stops becoming something new. He looked at the photograph again. We're not willing to stop. Yil Theron said nothing for a while. The council will see this as a threat, she said. I know. 212 civilizations. I know. And she stopped, started again. You're not afraid. Marcus picked up the book, set it down, didn't open it. We're afraid, he said quietly. We've been afraid since my grandmother's working group met in a conference room in Lagos 31 years ago and looked at the data and understood what was coming. We've been afraid every day since. Fear isn't the problem. He looked up at her. Fear just means you understand the stakes. It doesn't mean you stop. He looked at the photograph one more time. She used to say that the most dangerous thing a civilization can do is make another civilization believe that they've found the bottom of its willingness to continue, because there isn't one. He said it simply, without drama, the way you describe a feature of the world. We keep going. That's what we do. We don't know how not to. The council session reconvened 3 days later, and D. Her Vaz was not leading it. The new session chair was a Velharan elder named Counselor Sto, who had spent 40 years studying what the archives called civilizational edge cases, meaning civilizations that had not followed predicted integration paths. There weren't many, but she knew all of them. She opened the session by reading aloud a single line from humanity's first response to the ultimatum. We have already begun. She read it twice. Then she set down her reader. We have spent 3 weeks, she said, treating this as a negotiation. It is not a negotiation. A negotiation is 2 parties discussing terms that neither has yet acted on. She looked around the chamber. The humans acted on their terms before the discussion existed. What we have been treating as their opening position is, in fact, their middle position. We do not know what their beginning looked like. We do not know what their end looks like. We have been in this room for 3 weeks under the impression that we are determining the outcome, and I am now formally telling this council that we are not. The silence in the chamber was very different from the silence in Yil Theron's memory of the first negotiation room. This one had weight. The question before us, Sto continued, is not how to integrate Earth. The question is whether we understand what Earth is, and whether we understand what we have already set in motion by treating them as a standard integration candidate, and whether we have any realistic method of undoing that. She paused. I will tell you that I have reviewed the technical analysis of the fleet distortion event. I will tell you that the human infrastructure responsible for that event was placed over a period of years, using trajectories that were individually invisible to our monitoring systems. I will tell you that removing it would require locating thousands of distributed components in a solar system we do not control. I will tell you that we have no evidence that the infrastructure we've identified represents the full extent of what has been deployed. And I will tell you that the second message names 11 other civilizations who have been engaged in similar work. She let that sit for a moment. We did not integrate Earth, she said. We introduced ourselves to something that was already building. The formal resolution took 4 months. Yil Tharon was on the drafting committee. It was the most complex document the Council had produced in 2 centuries, and when it was done it said, in language that would be studied in diplomatic archives for generations, that Earth would enter a new categorical relationship with the Galactic Council. Not integration, not alliance. Something the committee invented a new word for, a word that translated, roughly, as acknowledged continuity. Recognition that Earth existed, that it intended to continue existing, that it had demonstrated capacity for independent long-term operation, and that the Council accepted this as a material fact of the current galactic reality. Marcus signed it without ceremony. Adiz witnessed it. Neither of them smiled. Yil Tharon, watching from across the chamber, understood the absence of a smile. This was not victory for them. Victory would have meant the risk was over. The risk was not over. The risk would never fully be over, and they knew it, and they had factored it into their plans already, and they would continue planning around it for as long as humans were humans. She thought about the woman in the photograph. The grandmother who had written a letter addressed to no one for a conversation that hadn't happened yet and had placed it in a young man's hands and apparently said, "Bring this. You'll know when." She thought about what it took to be that precise about the shape of the future. Not psychic. Not lucky. Just attentive. In the specific way you could only be attentive if you had genuinely accepted that you might not live to see the outcome and had decided that didn't change anything. She thought about the pressed flower sealed under glass, still showing color in the dark of a moon that no one had been supposed to find. She thought about Dr. Miriam Vasquez, who had looked directly into a recording device 9 years ago, in a building on an inhospitable moon, speaking to 14 ship captains who didn't exist yet, about a conversation she would never have. She had not looked afraid. Yil Tharon looked at Marcus, who was gathering his papers, physical papers, she noticed, not data chips, and she thought about how she would write her final report on this, and how she would explain to the 6,000 years of institutional memory behind her that a civilization of 9 billion had looked at the weight of the entire galaxy aligned against them, and responded not with surrender, not with defiance, not with desperate last heroism, but with patience. With a 31-year project conducted in quiet buildings by careful people who had understood that the most important thing was not to win the moment, but to survive into the next one, and the one after that, and however many ones after that it took, distributing pieces of themselves so widely across the dark that there would never be a single place where all of Earth existed, and never a single blow that could end it. She thought about what that said about what humanity was. Not what it could do, what it was at the level below strategy, below culture, below language. And she thought about the 11 other civilizations in the network, and what they had learned from humanity's example, and what they were doing right now in their own unremarkable buildings in their own quiet languages, writing letters to futures they would not witness, preparing furniture for conversations not yet scheduled. The galaxy was not changing. It had already changed. Someone 31 years ago in a conference room in Lagos had looked at data that everyone else would have called a warning and had treated it instead as an invitation to prepare, to persist, to build something that could not be finished in a single lifetime and so would simply be continued by the next one, and the one after that, and however many it took. And they had not been afraid. And that was the thing, Yil Tharon understood finally, that no integration protocol had ever accounted for. Not the technology, not the infrastructure, not the distributed seeds or the echoing fleets or the 11 allied civilizations or the mountains of careful documentation. These were symptoms. These were the shape that a specific quality left on the world when given 30 years and 9 billion practitioners. The quality was this. Humans had decided, at some point so early in their history it may have been before they were fully human, that stopping was not a category of response available to them. Not stubbornness, not pride, something quieter and more permanent than either, a simple refusal so deep it had become structural to accept that any given moment represented the final accounting. There was always another move. There was always another generation. There was always another letter to write and another moon to leave it on and another child to hand it to with the quiet instruction, "You'll know when." The Galactic Council had arrived to end a story. They had not understood that humanity did not experience itself as a story that could end. And somewhere in the solar system right now, seeds continued along their long elliptical paths through the dark, carrying their payloads of memory and instruction, and pressed flowers in children's shoes, and recorded music to coordinates no one had looked up yet, waiting patiently in the cold for the moment when someone would need to find them. Waiting the way that only something built by beings with no concept of giving up could wait. The way that the galaxy was only now beginning to understand. Humanity had always waited.